Good morning. This is Mr. Herman. We'll be going over the Remediation for Geometric Concepts 2 pretest. So, to start with, we're going to look at a couple figures here, and we're going to write all of our congruency statements based on the markings. So, number one, we've got a couple angles here, and let's go ahead and look at some components that we know are congruent. So, as we can recall, our symbols, or our markings rather, on our angles or sides are going to tell us what is congruent. So right here, we have this angle and we have this angle that are congruent. So let's go ahead and name those. If we recall, the middle letter is the vertex, so where the actual angle is, and then on the front end and the back end are the other two letters. So this angle right here is HGI. And based on the markings, we know that it's congruent to angle KJL. Okay. Now, if we take a look at our other marking that we have here, we've got one mark on this line, one mark on this line, and that means that both of those lines have to be congruent. So we can go ahead and show that these segments are congruent with GI, or segment GI, is congruent to segment J. Okay, so go ahead and try number 2 on your own before we go over that question. All right, so let's go ahead and go over number 2. Hopefully you already answered that one. So we're going to take a look at our markings here. We've got some angles marked right here. We know that these are congruent because there's one mark here and one mark here. Okay, it's a little bit different than what we've seen typically, but it still shows that since these markings are the same, these are going to be congruent angles. So on number 1, we use 3 letters to show that 2 angles were congruent. We can also just use one angle, one letter, especially if our angles can't be confused with anything else. So we have angle C is congruent to angle Z. Let's go and look at our markings again, and we've got another pair of angles here. We got 2 markings right here, and we got 2 markings right here. So then we can make the statement that angle A is congruent to angle X. And we've got one more pair of congruent parts because our markings on their side, that has one mark on it, this has one mark on it. Okay, so that means that those sides have to be congruent. And we'll go ahead and make that statement of AB is congruent to segment, X, Y. Okay? So, we're going to go ahead and move on. And rather than identify what's congruent from our markings, we're going to go ahead and put the markings on the figures based off of what we are told is congruent. Okay? So we're kind of going backwards now. So let's go ahead and look at each of our congruency statements and then put some markings on there. So we are told that AB is congruent to FE. So I got that in blue, if you can tell that. Since that's a side, let's go ahead and find AB. So there's A, there's B. I'm going to go and put one mark on that. Let's go ahead and find FE on our other figure, FE. Since we know that they're congruent, they both have to have one mark. Let's go to our next congruency statement. We have AD is congruent to FG. Once again, those are sides. Now, since we're not told that they're congruent to AB and FE, we do have to use a different marking to show that they are congruent to each other, but not to the other sides. So rather than just put one mark on those sides, we'll go ahead and put 2. So here's AD, 2 markings there, and then over here with FG, 2 markings there. All right, so that shows us that AD and FG are congruent, but they're not congruent to AB and FE. We've got one last pair of congruent parts, and those are angles DCB and angle GHE. So let's go ahead and find those on our figure. So we have DCB. Remember, this middle letter is our vertex. That's where our angle is actually going to be. And we're going to put one mark there. Okay. And we look here, we got GHE. So H is in the middle. That's our vertex. That's where our angle is going to be. GHE. Okay, so there we go. Go ahead and answer the question associated with number 4 before we talk about that problem. Okay, so now that you've answered number 4, let's go ahead and kind of check your work here. So let's start with FH is congruent to JH. So since those are sides, we're going to go ahead and find those and go ahead and start with 1 mark on them. So here's FH, 1 line, and we've got JH. We'll put another line. Okay, so those markings will show us that FH and JH are in fact congruent sides. Let's go look at our next pair of congruent parts. We have angle GFH and angle KJH. So once again, let's make sure we recall that the middle letter is our vertex. So angle GFH is going to be right here. And then if we look at our other part, we have angle KJH. So KJH. And so we'll go ahead and mark right here. Okay, so our first pair of angles, we'll go ahead and just use 1 marking. And now we've got one last pair of congruent parts, and those will be angles. So just like we saw in number 3 when we had a second pair of congruent sides, we had to use a different marking. And so now that we have a second pair of congruent angles, we're going to also have to use a different marking. So let's see. We've got angle GHF. I'm going to keep reminding you all that middle letter there is our vertex. That's where angle is going to be. So we have GHF. So our angle is going to go here. Now I can't just put 1 mark because it's not congruent to the other angles, or we're at least not told that. So I'm going to go and put 2. And then our other angle is KHJ. KHJ. And since we know they're congruent, I have to put another 2 marks there as well. Now, before I move on, I do want to point out, you might be wondering, well, what about number 2? They had these little marks here. Okay, can I do that? Of course you can. As long as we have a distinguished way of looking at the markings and telling which parts are congruent to each other and which parts are not congruent to each other. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do a couple more problems. We got 5 and 6 to go. So in our video yesterday for looking at our triangle theorems, we were talking about angle bisectors. So we're going to go ahead and kind of bring those out a bit more here. And we're going to draw an angle bisector. Okay, so if we recall from yesterday, an angle bisector is going to cut an angle in half. So I'm just going to kind of estimate. That looks pretty close. Okay. I'm going to call this point, let's see, A, B, C. I'll call this point D. Okay. So we did that. We're going to label the congruent parts. Okay, so if we cut this big angle, angle BAC, in half, that means that this angle right here and this angle right here should be congruent. Now, they look like they might not be congruent based off of our markings because they look like they're different sizes. However, since there's 1 arc here and 1 arc here, those markings tell us that those angles are in fact congruent. So let's go ahead and identify those angles. We've got angle BAD. BAD. It's a bad angle. And then we've got angle CAD that are congruent then. Okay? So there's our congruency statement about our resultant angles. Now go ahead and answer this question number 6. Try that one on your own before we go over it together. Okay, so yesterday we also saw the reflexive property again. And if we recall, the reflexive property has to do with something being congruent to itself. So in this case, we have to look for the one part that is the same in both triangles. So we have triangle ABD, triangle CDB, and the one thing that is shared is this line here in the middle. Okay? So since it's in both triangles, we do have to still make the remark that it is congruent to itself, because then we show it's congruent in the top triangle, we show it's congruent in the bottom triangle. Okay? So in this case, we could make the statement that DB is congruent to DB. Most of the time, if not always, we will have the exact same thing on both sides of the reflexive property, especially with sides. When we get to angles, as you'll see on the notes that you'll work on, it's a little bit different. However, it's the same angle. It's showing us the same angle. All right, so go ahead and work on your notes before you take the post test at the end of class today.